Future Literacy and Anticipation Research Unit. We're going to listen today to the speech from Laura De Vito, who is a researcher and professor at the University of Wales, and she's going to give us a speech about her recent work for the Welsh government, leading and organizing a foresight unit dealing with SDGs campaign and the involvement of the Welsh government in projects for sustainable development. Okay, thank you, Laura. I'll leave to you the presentation, please.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here on International Women's Day and after a brilliant week in Trento. I'm very grateful for the hospitality and the kindness with which the university and the whole city has welcomed me. I had a brilliant time, so thank you very much. So today, it's an opportunity for me to share some insights from a recent research project that I conducted in partnership with the Welsh government, and to tell you a bit more about the work that I am doing that hopefully will be interesting for you. Before I go into the details of the project, just so that you know a bit more about my background. So I'm a public policy scholar. I specialize in environmental public policy. I cover topics such as air, water quality, climate change, and nature-based solutions. And my research has always been at, as we say, at the science and policy interface. That means that it's challenge-driven, very applied, and it's co-produced with policymakers to deal with problems that they face. I'm also part of an interdisciplinary research group at the University of the West of England. It's the Air Quality Management Resource Centre. I'm the only social sciences scientist, so I lead social sciences work within my group. And I started working on futures and foresights relatively recently, in early 2022, when I received the grant for this research project. Whereas in the past, my research has focused on air pollution in Delhi, in India, young people's experience and emotions in relation to the climate crisis, and also industrial decarbonization. And I will tell you something more about it at the end of the presentation. So today I'm going to say a bit about the context of Wales, which is unique, world-leading, and really path-breaking in terms of well-being and sustainable development governance. And I'm going to explain how my research has helped them, or is helping them, to strengthen their long-term approach to policy making. And then at the end, I'm going to take the opportunity to mention the most current research project, which is about a local industrial decarbonization plan, in which I'm going to apply foresight. So, how do we intend foresight? Foresight is a way of thinking, a practice, underpinned by methods, techniques that help actors, policymakers, to engage, to develop future regarding policies and interventions. And I'm using the term future regarding deliberately here, as opposed to other common terminology like future-focused or future-oriented, because in line with a political theorist called Michael McKinsey, future regarding, according to his interpretation, conveys the idea that we look at this future without disregarding the present. So it's more about bridging the gap between us and future generations rather than just focusing on the future. So this is just for clarity. I also interpret foresight following proper definitions that identifies three facets of foresight. So foresight, the way I apply it, is a process that is participatory. So it involves multiple stakeholders, multiple views that come together and work on a certain challenge project. It is prospective, obviously. We use techniques that help us to engage with the future and understand it and think about it. And also it's policy-oriented, so it has a clear, explicit aim at informing policymaking. So it's not, there are some features exercise that are more about creativity and lateral thinking and maybe team building. Here I'm referring to a kind of foresight that is very much aiming at policy, strengthening policy. And why do governments use foresight? There are several reasons that they decide to invest time and resources to develop their foresight capacities and capabilities. They can use it to engage with uncertainty and deal with it. The challenges that we're facing are very complex, and foresight techniques help them to be proactive in dealing and in handling this complexity and this uncertainty in a way that is quite proactive in the policy formulation stage, for example. It can also be used to stress test and assess the long-term consequences of policies and interventions, so as a consequence assessment, or to identify early signals of change, monitoring emerging issues as they arise, so as an early warning mechanism, or also as a tool to engage citizens in co-creating, co-developing in a way that is open and allows also contestations, to co-develop visions for the future, so values, norms, and ways to achieve them. And it's also very useful as a mechanism of learning within government and organizations, between government departments, for example, to drive policy learning and work beyond silos and beyond departmentalism. So yes, these are the key reasons. There are others, obviously, but these are the key ones. And throughout my research, I have identified two levels of foresight in governments. There is the foresight, the strategic foresight that is led by the so-called strategic foresight units. These are distinct and recognizable teams that are resourced and located normally in very central locations within governments, so cabinet office or the office of the president, depending on the governance arrangement. And they have ongoing foresight responsibilities, so they produce megatrend reports, they conduct horizon scanning, they liaise with parliaments, for example, in Finland does that, they provide training. And then there is another level, which I've been calling embedded foresight, and this is the diffuse application of foresight on a daily basis, so applied to individual policies, interventions. So here, this is a much more challenging way to mainstream foresight because it implies and requires a cultural shift, a migration of a mindset to really embed foresight as a practice that informs the way civil servants, policymakers approach problems in the first place. And this is what we think can really strengthen, create an anticipatory system that goes also beyond the corridors of government to involve civil society. And obviously here we have Professor Poli, who's a world-leading scholar on anticipatory governance, so I'm not going to explain to you what that means. This is an example of a very high recent and very high-profile foresight work to give you a sense of how foresight can stimulate at very high level strategically government discussions. This was a report that was published last year by the Government Office for Science, which is a central UK government team, and it's called Net Zero Society Scenarios and Pathways. They have, there was quite an extensive work of evidence gathering. They identified key drivers, key uncertainties, then developed 4 scenarios in a narrative way, and then they added an extra step, which I think it was what really added innovation and substance to this. They modeled that they did a quantification exercise to understand what the implications of ending up in each of the 4 scenarios were in terms of the UK's ability to achieve net zero by 2050, which is the government goal for climate mitigation. And these are the 4 scenarios that they produced. The key drivers that they focused on were technological change and economic growth. So the 4 scenarios, they are narratives based on different evolutions of these 2 key uncertainties. And the quantification, the message that came through the quantification exercise was that net zero can be achieved in all 4 of the scenarios. So regardless of how technological change and economic growth will play out, we can meet the net zero target, which I think is a very powerful message to convey the government especially at this point in time. And this was really used to stimulate a lot of strategic discussion in the UK government. So moving on now to discuss the Welsh case. As I said in my introduction, Wales is unique. And so Wales is one of the 4 constituent nations of the United Kingdom. It has devolved power since 1998. And since 1998, it's been quite at the forefront of sustainable development. On the back of various years of public engagement, they conducted a visioning exercise called the Wales We Want. And this exercise, this participatory exercise, underpinned what in 2015 then became a groundbreaking, world-leading legislative framework called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. That sets in law 7 wellbeing goals. These are prosperous Wales, resilient Wales, healthier, more equal, Wales of cohesive communities, vibrant culture, and thriving Welsh language, and a globally responsible Wales. So these are loosely based on the SDGs, but they are the results of a localization exercise, and that's why, so in a way that makes sense for Wales, and that's why, for example, the cultural pillar of sustainable development became a striking feature of this act. At first glance, it's not something that is so unusual. What is unusual is that all of these goals have legal definitions that are set in law, and they are not that banal as definitions. They're underpinned by values and norms and visions for the future. For example, the prosperous Wales, clearly the definition indicates a willingness to go beyond GDP, because it talks about efficient use of resources, good quality education, and good work conditions. So they're clearly proposing a vision that is value-based for the future. And these are legally binding. And they're legally binding not just to the government, they're legally binding to the entire public sector in Wales. So there are around 50 public sector organizations that are bound by this act, fall under this framework. So imagine schools, hospitals, fire brigades, environmental agencies, national parks. They all have to demonstrate in everything they do that they are contributing to one or more of these goals. There are no enforcement mechanisms, so there are no fines. However, they are accountable for it. They have to demonstrate that they're doing this. And this is already shaping, although it's been criticized for lacking teeth, and the approach that they took was towards a cultural, whole country approach, cultural shift rather than a regulatory, sort of top-down approach. And this is already shaping the path that Wales is taking. For example, last year, the Welsh government scrapped all projects for major road buildings because it wasn't the investment on new roads or major roads for cars and trucks wasn't deemed to be compatible with the vision of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The way transport interventions are assessed, they have integrated cost-benefit analysis with wellbeing considerations, and so it's delivering real-world consequences in the way policies are defined. There is an architecture behind the Act that helps these organizations to deliver. So at the top, this is the diagram that sort of summarizes how these architectures work. So there are at the top the well-being goals, and then there are some tools for evidence gathering, evidence-based, so there are national indicators and milestones for progress, and then there is a future trends report that they have to approve, and they're to publish every 5 years, and it has to be approved by the Parliament, which is called the Senate. They also identified 5 ways of working sustainably. So these are behaviors that civil servants, people working in the public sector, are expected to have. And they also have legal definitions that are set in the Act. And these are collaboration, integration, involvement, prevention, and long-term. So long-term is a behavior, consideration of long-term is a behavior that is set in law in Wales. Another point of interest is the establishment and the creation of the figure of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. This is an independent figure that is nominated every 7 years and is the role of the guardian of the act. So it can speak up and work with the government and other public organizations to represent the voices of future generations. This was an experiment that was tried elsewhere in the past. It didn't work in other countries, but now we're already at the second commissioner, so it seems like the relationship is working. This is just to show you what the Future Trends report looks like. So they took 6 megatrends, fairly standard megatrends. Again, the characteristics we think makes it an interesting case is that the way they have been translated at the local level is very granular. So they take each trend then explored more in detail, and they describe the impacts of this trend on the whole of the territory of Wales, even with distinctions between, for example, the north part of the country and the southern part of the country. The north is more rural, the south is more, there are bigger cities and there's higher density of population. So you can understand the impact of these trends at this level of granularity, which it means that it's directly applicable, potentially, to policy making, to policy. It's not something that remains at the global level, it's very relevant. And the idea was that this Future Trends report should have been used, or should be used as a live tool to inform all policies, basically. Their expectations, their aspirations was that this could be used on a daily basis by policymakers and to inform, to identify risks and opportunities, scenarios, and then applications to policies. However, this was an area of long-term, all the 5 ways of working sustainably and the application of the Future Trends report were identified as an area that required improvements, that where they were struggling, because as we know, it's difficult to shift from the business as usual ways of working to then engage with futures thinking, and that's where my project came into place. So my project was part of a fairly innovative scheme funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, which funds the social research in the UK. And it's different from other research projects because it basically allowed me to spend 18 months within the Welsh Government essentially as one of their employees. So I had their IT systems, I had their laptops, I was attending their meetings, even not related to my research projects necessarily, and that meant that I could really understand the organizational culture, and we were able to discuss things, and I was able to provide my expertise on a number of topics on a daily basis, and for me it was incredibly useful because I could understand what the real challenges were, so not as an external. It also helped me with trust. They knew I was one of them, so I wasn't coming as an external. So yeah, this was the first iteration, and it's a scheme that is continuing in the UK currently. And then at the end of the project, I published a report that is publicly available that looks at different experiences in Europe, and then it's got case studies, specific case studies of Wales. So conceptually, I started, because they asked me to focus on well-being and sustainable development, I started thinking about the key challenges, if you like, of sustainable development and well-being governance. The uncertainty, we know a lot about things like climate change, but there are also some uncertainties in the way that certain impacts may manifest in different communities, different geographies. And so that means we need to be prepared and really try to anticipate this impact. The complexity, again, there are different views, different priorities, even in the same village. There are different interests that we need. So that complexity, we can't ignore it. We need to value it and handle it. And then there are time lags in the sense that decisions that we take now will have consequences in the future. So how can we bring that future into the present when we discuss what we should do. So the need for policies to be futures regarding. And my research questions were two. One was more about the mechanisms and the structures that were required in governments to improve foresight as an embedded practice. They were particularly interested in understanding how to embed foresight as a practice, as a mindset. So in terms of structures and in terms of capabilities, behaviors, what civil servants as teams or as individuals, what do they need to be able to apply foresight, regularly. And because I'm a political scientist, I approach this with a new institutionalist lens that, yes, recognizes the role of structures and organizational arrangements and mechanisms, but also looks at incentives, so if you like, the more rational choice side of it, but also importantly norms and values, which I think in the context of Wales, this mission-based framework that they had was particularly interesting perspective to consider. So yeah, this was my sort of theoretical approach to the research questions. The methodology, so the fellowship was divided into three phases. As I said, I was completely embedded in their unit. I was working in a central unit called the Sustainable Futures Division. So we could just, on a daily basis, I could work with them to understand, co-design the research questions and the research plan. And then during the intermediate phase, the delivery phase, I conducted some desk-based research, and then I did 35 interviews with experts, both in Wales, but also outside of Wales. Countries, I consider countries like Portugal, Finland, the Flemish government, and then I conducted 3 foresight policy pilots. So we identified 3 policy teams within the Welsh government that were working on real policies, and one legislation. And I went there, I approached them to say, can we apply foresight? And so I was able to directly contribute to real policies that then were approved. And finally, 2 stakeholder workshops. One that involved key external stakeholders, so the Future Commissioner's Office, Natural Resource Wales, Public Health Wales, to think about the foresight ecosystem, so bringing in the anticipatory governance element. And one with, final one with really senior civil servants in the Welsh government, so directors, deputy directors, to think about what could change within the organization to enable more, to enable futures thinking. And obviously I don't have the space to talk about everything, but I think probably it would be useful for me to focus on the pilots. So this was an example of one of them. They are conducted with the air quality team. The other teams were transport and education. And they were working on the new, which is just been approved actually, it's just been converted into an act. They were working on the Environment, Air Quality and Soundscapes bill, which is interesting because they bring together air quality, sound and noise, which is already interesting. So with them, we applied mainstream traditional foresight techniques, so a futures wheel, imagining that the bill were already became law, and we were looking at 5 years into the futures, and from that they could identify potential risks and opportunities that they didn't consider, so they were able to shift some priorities on the spot. They also then, at the point we brought in the Future Trends report, to consider how the key trends could affect the ability of the bill to deliver clean air, but also vice versa, how the cleaner bill could help accelerate or decelerate certain trends. From that, we then developed 3 scenarios. They decided to go for this typology of scenarios, worse than expected, better than expected, and different than expected scenarios. And these has helped them to identify, for example, stakeholders, even within the government that they haven't engaged with, and they could work on some priority actions, identify some priority actions to to start that cross-departmental work. And as a result of these pilots, this cross-departmental work, happened, and also the language around the act changed as well, because at the end we contextualized the bill within the Wellbeing Act and the Wellbeing Goals, and they were much more able, through the futures thinking exercise, to identify links between something that can be quite specific and the Wellbeing Goals. So they helped them to see equality not as a single issue, but as something that is a social issue. So yeah, some of the benefits that they highlighted, they said that really it helped them to see the problem from a different perspective. And they reassessed the role of stakeholders. In bold, I have put the 5 ways of working sustainably, so that you can see how the foresight helped directly to implement, to adopt these behaviors. So yeah, they could critically reassess the role of stakeholders, because they realized that the stakeholder map for the present was slightly different than the stakeholder map in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time. So they realized that some stakeholders they thought were important today, maybe in the long term were less important, and vice versa. That completely led to a reconsideration of the stakeholder engagement strategy. And as I said, yeah, the consideration of the bigger picture, I think, for them was the most striking element, because that brought in a much more strategic consideration of how to tackle a complex issue such as pollution. And yes, they identified new futures, risks, and opportunities that helped with prevention and long term. In all of these, I have to say that the Wellbeing Act gave us a really clear platform. So it acted as a golden thread that really gave a focus on our foresight activities, and it was recognized by participants. They said that it gave them permission to think differently, it gave them space. So these institutional signals are important, essentially. Obviously, there were some challenges that they told me about. Clearly, just learning how to conduct a futures wheel, yes, was useful, but not enough to achieve that cultural shift, that mindset. But still, it was recognized that maybe doing it in partnership with another team could still drive that policy learning, the institutional learning. The other thing that came through was the need for foresight to be inclusive, because it can, obviously you're dealing with real problems, and you need to consider how people will be affected by your decisions. And across the board, I found a strong demand for foresight in government. Everyone, with no particular interest or stake, they said that they think it's needed, especially with the context of crisis. It's needed. It helps them to think strategically. So it's a problem, but there are some organizational barriers that means that they don't have the time, the space. They tend to work in silos. So there are things that completely can be done to enable foresight to be, to realize its benefit. So yes, this is how foresight has the potential to directly contribute to sustainable development and well-being governance, and really create this anticipatory system within an organization and beyond. But you need the right institutional signals to it. The organization needs to do their part. So it's kind of both bottom-up and top-down approach that is needed to drive change. And the fact that we had a focus, so very clear, explicit, high-level strategic goals that civil servants knew were underpin the government's action was important, was really important. Both to sell foresight, to convince them to engage, but also in terms of outputs, they really shape. So it can be well-being, it can be sustainable development, defense. So I think it's important to have clarity about what you want to achieve with foresight. So yeah, going back to my diagram that I introduced earlier on. So it was clear that the prospective nature of foresight helps with the uncertainty, dealing with the uncertainty and being prepared, anticipating risks, opportunities. Opportunities sometimes are kind of not talked a lot about, but we found a lot of opportunities as well as risks. The participatory element that helps, plugs into the complexity challenge, because you involve different stakeholders and enable multiple views to shape these visions of the future. And the fact that it had a clear policy angle, a clear policy focus, helped to bridge that gap, if you like, between the futures and the present, so handle these time lags and improve, essentially, come up with better policies. Just to conclude, this is my new project. So the Welsh Government project finished earlier in 2023, and now this is a project that is just started. It's funded by Innovate UK, and it's called the West of England Industrial Decarbonisation Plan. It's led by the West of England Combined Authority, which is sort of like a provincial kind of thing. So there are different councils, different local authorities. There are private actors, so big industrial groups, but it has a place-based approach. So that means that we're approaching decarbonisation not per sector, not looking at energy, manufacturing, etc., but from the perspective of place. So involving also the expectations of the local community, the infrastructure available, what efficiencies can be made, what can be shared. And I will be providing, as academic lead, I will be providing a foresight frame to the project. In my spare time, that we know in academia is abundant, I have started, as I was discussing with Mario earlier, I started looking at the issue of critical futures. So I'm interested to see who is proposing views of the futures and who is accepting them and who is challenging them, because it was clear from the applications that this is an important consideration to have. This was all for me. It's like a trilingual, it's Italian, Welsh, and English. Because Welsh is completely bilingual. Well, the Welsh government is a completely bilingual organization. So, diolch, and thank you very much again.
Thank you, Laura. Maybe we can see if there are some of our online participants and someone also from that wants to ask specific questions to Laura. Okay? Yeah, let's see if there are someone or maybe in the chat. Let's see. Yeah, I will ask to the participants at home to put some maybe. We'll pause
recording stopped.
Because we don't need it anymore. Discussion, and let's see if there are issues that come out in the chat. Okay. Actually, I would like Laura to ask you one question. Okay, you presented a very interesting experience of involving with public officers and government. And you also pointed to the fact that future literacy is like a demand from some of these public administration. But what you do foresee, or I mean, can you tell us about what specific skills and competencies they are looking for? Because when we talk about future literacy, we see that sometimes there is like misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Can you please?
So that's interesting. So it's a very good question. So if you talk to policymakers, there's what policymakers and civil servants need and what policymakers think they need. So what they think they need is a template to do the exercise. They just want like, okay, just give us, the shape of the future's wheel and we'll do it. What they actually, I think, they more like critical thinking and expertise. So the ability to step out of their immediate area and think laterally. And it's not that they don't have it necessarily, but they're not used to do it because they work in silos. So I think that in terms of how to achieve that, I think learning by doing is definitely the only way to go in a government that is busy, because they may do some online training course maybe one day, but they want to learn, the learning by doing element was really helpful because they didn't have to take time out of their daily job. It was part of their daily job. So yeah, I would say that it's more about that mindset shift, and that how do you achieve that? By doing it, by engaging in the exercises. So I left them all the templates. I left them the agenda. I said, with the timings, the plan. So I said, use it, adapt it. I don't care. It's public resource. Publish it. Do what you want. But that's the easy part. That I think the difficult part is to get them together with people that maybe are outside their immediate area and make them realize that we're dealing with social issues nowadays, that we can't just think in silos anymore. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It clarified a lot of doubts that I have concerning the role that it also, I think, highlights the difference between a scientific approach than to maybe a practitioner approach, because a practitioner may be more interested in providing tools and methods which are useful, are very important, but they don't necessarily allow public governments in particular to do that step that you mentioned. So reorganizing even their own way of designing points.
Yes, completely. Yeah, I said in one of my recommendations, I put it in a very soft way, but essentially I said, do not rely on external consultants, because they will come in, they will do a fantastic workshop, write a very flashy, colorful report, and then you will know what to do with it. I said, just save the Welsh government that money, and it's better to do something that is maybe less flashy, less sophisticated, but that you do it and change the way you're thinking. So, for example, I suggested, now I work with the transport team and the air quality team. I know that these two sectors are very much related, and I know that there will be people that have some skills, so one can facilitate a session and the other one can facilitate the other section, so kind of cross-learning, community practice type of approach. But yeah, I said in very soft, gentle terms, do not rely on external consultants, because and they recognize actually that having me in an internal capacity, because Francesca was explaining that I was an employee of the Welsh government essentially. I was using their IT system, I had a badge that was fully embedded. They were completely relaxed, they trusted me. So it was kind of a safe space for them to discuss things openly. And they said, you're a critical friend, because you know where to push us and when to leave us alone. Because we were dealing with, especially with the air quality team, we were dealing with very emotive issues, poor health outcomes, social inequality, and I could sense sometimes that people were becoming stressed about it. So I moved on and then came back. So you need to know really the organizations, and I could do it because I was spending 18 months with them. But otherwise, I would be really careful. Yes.
I have a question about the balance between the scientific side of future studies and the practitioner, one with more practical one. How was working? What was working with policymakers' life, and how did you manage to make them understand what you were doing, want also to learn from that? Because the future studies is so that we are somewhat ideas like the future. People might have expectations about outcomes of workshops and activities. and when they don't see that outcome or they don't, or the expectation match.
Yeah.
Uncertainty will disrupt my day.
Yeah, so how I got buy-in to that basically, how do we get them engaged? So it was a long, I mean, it took a long time. So we started, we went to the senior person. So my senior person went to their senior person and said, what are the teams that you think are not completely engaged, but not completely like, you know, disengaged. So someone that maybe is maybe open to the idea. And so that was kind of the director's input that said, well, meet this person. We did an introductory session, very informal, very non-structured, where I introduced myself, the project. I very much sold it as something that the Welsh government seemed interested in doing, and that would help them with the Wellbeing Act. And then I said, look, we're going to do an outcome mapping session before we go into the course site, and then you're going to tell me what do you need, what you want to achieve, what are your expectations. So we did that online, 1 hour, and they said we want to understand the risks, we want to understand what good looks like, we want to understand what failure would be. Okay, so I designed them, and then I went back to them with a draft methodology. So I said, okay, fine, based on what you said, I think that these methods would work for you and could deliver on the outcome that you said you need. They kind of agreed. I would say there were like 99% of the people in the team were on board by then. There was still someone that wasn't convinced. They were asking, why are we doing this? And you just go with it. Just trust the fact that they're in the room and post-its, they're magical one day. When people start moving things, something happens that means that they forget about everything else. And then the other thing that was key, I told them that we leave them all the material, that I wouldn't expect them to do anything in between sessions, so I drafted all the scenarios and I did all the work. And I said, look, by the end of the sessions, you're going to have 5 priority actions, roadmapped, each of them, and they're yours. You're going to go develop them. So they knew that they wouldn't end up just with they're useful, but just with the scenarios. But from the scenarios, I asked them to translate those scenarios into things that they could do. So the second half of the sessions was basically, okay, we've done the scenarios, some nice stories. What can we do to go towards the best scenarios and avoid and that was probably the most difficult part. But I had lots of preparations. Yeah. So that's it. But it takes time. That's why being embedded was transformative, really, because I wasn't arriving cold.
We see the reading for you. Thanks for your presentation. Who chose the SDGs to focus on? How about the complexity among the SDGs?
So we didn't consider the SDGs, we considered the 7 well-being goals, and we consider them as an integrated suite of goals, of strategic goals. So what we did, we dedicated a part of the session to analyze how that policy was contributing to all of the seven well-being goals, not disregard them. And we really tried to look at the trends even in a very integrated way, so that we were considering, the demographic trends, irrespective of the, digital connectivity trend. Obviously there are connections. So we tried to keep them together, but there wasn't any choice of SDG or goal, if you like.
Okay, thank you. I think that the question was from Martina Todaro, one of the. Thank you, Martina. I hope Laura clarified to you the question. Probably she is parting.
Yeah,
you mentioned the 7. The 7. Objectives, goals, or the questions are. It's also something maybe we're not used because we formally use the SDGs as a strategic goals.
Yeah.
But actually, since the Welsh government is posing, has been addressing this foresight perspective in advance, they already, are oriented, as you say.
Yeah.
And I haven't the question otherwise for Laura. The preparation of all these activities. Did you perform a review and also an exploration of other experience around the world about this type of involvement and which were the results and how they gathered you? Okay.
Yes, so I looked at, not all obviously, but some governments in Europe, Portugal, Finland, and the Flemish government, and the UK government. I have to say that in terms of policy applied foresight, that's something a bit tricky to find. So Portugal is trying to work towards it. The Flemish government can do maybe projects, but it's not really integrated in the policy cycle. Finland, in my opinion, although it's one of the most advanced cases, it's more focused on the strategic foresight and then maybe links with parliament and futures literacies. But from what I gathered, they don't apply to individual policies as much. So essentially, mine was, that's why the pilots, they were pilots. In the Welsh government, it was never tried before as an approach. And so I try to, how do you do it? You try to get to know the organization, essentially, and to try to think, I need foresight of my foresight pilots, essentially. I try to think, like, what are their concerns now? And so what kind of questions could they ask me? How can I be helpful to them? So that's why they were pilots, because they were quite new. Yeah. But in the report, I described these cases more extensively. And I think that, the reality is that foresight needs to respond to local context. So in Wales, they have very much framed it in the context of the wellbeing goals. In Portugal, it's much more linked. It's a relatively new unit that they've created called Plan Up, and they have linked it to big infrastructure investment, big planning. Finland is obviously much more established, and I think it's interesting to see how the relationship with the parliament is a bit more advanced. So you learn from all of this. It's not about copying them, but it's about learning what mechanisms could work in your context. So there were a lot of conversations with my division saying, Portugal is doing this. How would that work? What were the stopping points? Why shouldn't this work in Wales? And lots of things emerged. The way they organize responsibility, they allocate responsibilities between different professions in government. So there are the analysts. Some of them did the future trends report. Then there are the policy professions, the people I worked with. And then they said, it's all very well us doing this, and then the legal people come in and said, who comes to this? So, and then again, an organizational question for the people that are way above my pay grade was, how do we bring in the legal professions into the futures work? So you learn from all countries, but yeah.
I was wondering, I hope it's not too basic of a question, but I was wondering, what are the actual policies you were drafting on? Because you were mentioning there were 3 policies, and then one of them kind of went to legislation. I was just wondering what the actual kind of object of the report was.
So the legislation obviously was one aspect of the legislation that was creating new thresholds for pollution.
Or
air
pollution.
Air pollution. The education one was working redistributing the summer holidays. So they were working. So we worked at what if we take 3 weeks off the summer holidays and redistribute throughout the year. And to be fair, that was like, wow, the implications of doing that are immense. And the transport one was about renationalizing the an entire bus fleet in Wales. It's a country base, all buses renationalised. In the UK, they're mostly private.
So maybe you kind of added like a follow-up, but you kind of responded to this. How satisfied were you with the level of kind of, because I think one of the big important things in these kind of exercises is that when you're using these with younger folks, very often you get kind of creative ideas, you get things that are actually, that one might look forward. But with older folks, or like in this case adults, not older too much, but like just adults, right, established professionals, people that have expertise in this, I'm wondering, did you, just a gut feeling, did you get something which was actually interesting? Or did you get things that like, okay, I could have written this myself?
No, I don't think I could. I definitely could have done it because I lacked the specialist knowledge. I think for them, it was seeing links between issues that they hadn't considered, really opened up the horizon. So, for example, when we were working with the education team about the summer holidays, lots of issues in terms of caring responsibilities and work and tourism, came up. With the transport team, or the airport team, in fact, they realized how, for example, climate change was almost it was complicated because although they share a lot of sources, climate change is much more attractive as an issue. So they thought about how could we work with the climate change team in a way that doesn't downplay air quality as an issue in the environment department. So there was some creativity involved. I think it was more about really broadening the horizon. And there were some light bulb moments. I can't say how transformative, because I wasn't, apart from the air quality team, I wasn't really a subject expert in either transport and also, again, these being pilots were very internal. So they chose, I gave them the option to involve external stakeholders, but they didn't want to. They wanted to try it, and they wanted to be free to try it. Then, they said that they would replicate this externally, but it wasn't, I think it was beyond the scope of what they could do.
That was actually the question I was going to ask about how do you evaluate the opportunity to insert external stakeholder and representative of community, because when you have different different perspective and in particular different time agenda, that's where the conflict must be aroused.
I gave them the option. In the first session, I said, look, I've got the resources and the time to do this. Because it was the first time, it was a learning, it was more like a learning. So the aim of the pilots were not so much, like the policies were an excuse. It was more about how does foresight work in the Welsh government and what are the barriers for this work to become mainstream. So that's why I wasn't, obviously it's in the limitations of the report, it's all acknowledged, but we didn't worry too much about that because the aim wasn't, I wasn't commissioned to do a foresight study, otherwise I would have pushed a lot to say, meet open. But because it was about seeing the process, I didn't care about what policies were chosen, I didn't care about that much. In fact, I think it was better because they had to learn, and it was a lot for them to take, so they were free to just...
And it's also good in terms of future literacy, because if you don't have the pressure to present immediately returns to what they are doing, that allows them also to modify practices that are usually embedded in the organizations, and are the ones that actually are more risky to approach directly. Because you cannot really restructure the usual usual way of organizing the public sector. If they're not able to slowly, but also constantly push them towards changes. Yeah.
Exactly. I gave them really the space to say, "Oh, we didn't work with that team. Maybe we should."
Yeah.
You know, in front of the public, it would be difficult to.
Yeah, definitely, because they will be afraid to face. They will face also problems concerning accountability of their own activity, and also problems relating also to aspects concerning the relevance of what they're doing. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I was very clear that with them I explained that we were doing a pilot. That I was very clear with them on this. Yeah.
Do you have questions or any other also curiosities from the online participants? Yeah. Do you want to put something on the chat? You don't see. If there are other issues, no. Okay, so I think that maybe it's we can thank you.
No, thank you.
Yeah, round out who is present. Oh, we see that maybe some are former students also. Someone that came out from exit from the virtual room. Most of them are former students of the master in social foresight and social anticipation, and they're interested in the issue. Yeah. Hello, Ada. Yeah, Martina and Carlo, we know all each other, and also Claudia, remember the plan. Okay, thank you for participating. So I say hello to all the online participants. Okay, thank you. And we close now the Zoom meeting. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for coming. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice weekend.
You too. On a Friday.